The most powerful thing controlling your future might be something that no longer exists, your past. You sit there tonight, maybe with gray in your hair and years behind you, still letting an old story make decisions for a man or woman who should know better by now. I know what it's like to be 25, broke, ashamed, replaying the same mistakes until they feel like your name, but here's the hard truth I had to learn. Your history is loud, but it is not in charge unless you keep handing it the keys. So let me ask you, before we go any further, are you willing, just for these next minutes, to question the story you've been telling about your life and entertain the idea that you are not your scars, not your failures, not your yesterday? Most people spend their whole life confusing two very different things: their history and their identity. History is what happened. Identity is who you decide to be now. And somewhere along the way, we start using the first to imprison the second. We say, "I've always been this way," and we don't realize that little sentence is a life sentence. I used to live like that. At 25 years old, broke, behind on my promises, I carried my story like a badge and a burden. My parents weren't rich, I didn't finish school, the economy is bad. That was my song. I could sing you every verse. But here's what I finally discovered. The story I kept repeating about my past was doing more damage than the past itself. The past was finished. The story was still active. That was the problem. See, most people don't just remember their history, they rehearse it, they polish it, they tell it over and over until it becomes part of their name. I'm the one who got divorced. I'm the one who lost the business. I'm the one who never figured out money. After a while, they aren't just talking about what happened, they're talking about who they believe they are. And when you believe that, your future gets very small, because the mind doesn't like to argue with your story. If you tell it often enough, it will go to work making sure your life matches your narrative. You say, "I always mess things up," and suddenly every mistake looks like proof. You say, I'm not the type of person who succeeds. An opportunity doesn't feel like possibility anymore. It feels like a threat. The story quietly tells you to step back, play small, stay the same. Now here's the contrast. There's another group of people. They have a past too. Some of them have a worse past than yours or mine. They've known failure, betrayal, bad choices, even shame. But they treat their story differently. They don't deny it. They don't run from it. They don't pretend it didn't happen. They just refuse to worship it. They use their history as a school, not a prison. They say, "I did that, but I'm not that. I walked through it, but I don't live in it anymore." They take the same raw material, loss, pain, regret, and turn it into wisdom, compassion, strength. Same facts, different use. Most people let their story become a verdict. The few let it become an education. And that one difference changes everything. When I met my mentor, he didn't argue with my past. He didn't say, "No, Jim, it wasn't that bad." He simply asked, "If your story is responsible for everything, why are there people with worse stories doing better than you?" That question hit me hard. It broke the spell. I realized I'd been using my history as an excuse, not as a reason to grow. My old story made me a victim. A new story could make me responsible. And responsibility, I learned, is where power starts. See, what everybody does is this. They let time write their story. They let circumstances, other people's choices, old memories, and old hurts hold the pen. They say things like, "After what happened to me, this is just who I am." They let the worst chapter define the whole book. What the people who change their life do is very different. They put the past in its place. They tell the truth about it. No denial, no sugarcoating, but they add one more sentence their old self never said. "That was me then. This is me now." They pick up the pen. They start a new chapter that doesn't ignore the last one, but doesn't bow down to it either. They decide that the most important thing about their past is what they do with it. That's the key idea of this whole message. You are not your story, you are the storyteller. The story can limit you or liberate you, and the difference is whether you let it define your ceiling or your starting line. Your past is a file, not a definition. It's a record, not a prophecy. The day you really understand that, you stop asking, "What did my story do to me?" and start asking, "What will I do with my story?" One keeps you tied to yesterday, the other opens the door to tomorrow. So let me ask you, from this moment on, are you willing to stop treating your story like a prison sentence and start treating it like a lesson plan for the person you still have time to become? Let me tell you about a man I met years ago. If you had seen him on the street, you'd say he was doing all right. Late 50s, nice car, decent suit, house paid for, kids grown. From the outside, he looked settled. But life is not lived on the outside. It's lived in the quiet places where nobody sees but you. And inside, this man was stuck in a story that had ended 25 years earlier. We met after one of my seminars. Most people had gone home. The crew was packing up. He waited off to the side, hands in his pockets, eyes on the floor. Finally, he walked over and said, "Mr. Rohn, I think your message came too late for me." Now that's an interesting opening line, isn't it? Too late. Right away, I heard the sound of a story that's been rehearsed. He sat down across from me and started talking. And what he really did was open a book he'd been carrying around forever. Page 1 was 1983. He'd started a small business with a friend, put everything into it, lost it all in a downturn. Bankrupt. Lost the house. Marriage on the rocks. A hard, painful chapter. No doubt about it. But here's what caught my attention. As he talked, his eyes weren't in the room with me. They were back there in that year. He told me the names, the dates, the details. He remembered the numbers on the foreclosure notice. He told me what his wife said the night she packed a bag to go stay with her sister. He told it like it happened last week. And then he switched to a different sentence, the sentence that had become his identity. "I'm the man who blew it. After that, I just tried not to rock the boat." Did you hear the shift? History, then identity. I'm the man who blew it. That's not what happened, that's who he believed he was. He said, "Since then, I've played it safe, took a job I don't like, stayed there 22 years, never tried anything big again. I tell my kids not to take risks. I tell them, don't end up like your old man." Then he said something that almost broke my heart. "Sometimes I feel like my real life ended in 1983, and everything since is just the credits rolling." That's the tragedy of an old story running a new life. I listened for a while, then I asked him a question I often ask in those moments. I said, "If I didn't know this was your story, and you told it to me like it was a movie, what would you call the main character? A failure or a survivor?" He stopped. Nobody had ever asked him that. He'd never watched his own film as a stranger. He thought for a long time and said, "I guess, a survivor." I said, "Good. So why have you spent 25 years calling the survivor a failure?" The facts didn't change, only the label did, and the label you chose has been making your decisions ever since. We sat in silence for a bit. You know, sometimes the most important part of a conversation isn't the words at all. It's the quiet right after them, when the truth finally has room to move in. I've learned over the years that the right pause can do more work than the right sentence. That's why, when we're finished here, I'll leave you a few moments of quiet at the end, so these ideas can settle where they belong, not just in your mind, but in your heart. I asked him, "Tell me, what do your kids know about you?" He said, "They know I lost the business. They know I couldn't provide for a while. They know I made a mess of things." I said, "All right, but do they know you never left? That you worked any job you could to keep the lights on? That you got up every morning and went back out into a world that embarrassed you? Do they know you stayed married? That you and your wife rebuilt from nothing? Do they know you paid every debt back over the years, even after the law said you didn't have to?" He blinked a few times. Nobody had listed those things out for him before. They were part of the story too, but they'd never made it into the headline. His title was still "The Man Who Blew It," not "The Man Who Rebuilt." I leaned forward and said, "My friend, somewhere along the line you let a painful chapter steal the rest of the book. You're not the bankruptcy. You're the man who walked through the bankruptcy and kept going. You're not the failure. You're the man who stood back up. But if you insist on calling yourself a failure, your future will salute that name and obey it." That's when something shifted in his face, just a little, like a light coming on in the back of the house, not the front. Quiet, but real. He said, "I've been telling the same story for so long, I don't know how to tell a different one." I said, "Good news is you don't have to erase the old story. You just have to add a new chapter and change the way you read the old ones." Then we got practical. Awareness is nice, but it doesn't change much until it meets action. I said, "Here's your first assignment. Go home and sit at the kitchen table with your kids, even if they're grown, even if you have to call them over. Tell them the whole story again, but this time, tell it from the point of view of the man who survived. Tell them what you learned about money, about trust, about starting over. Tell them how it made you stronger, not smaller. And at the end, don't say, 'So don't end up like your old man.' Say, 'Start where your old man left off.'" He wrote it down like homework. Second assignment, for the next 30 days, every time you tell yourself, "I'm the man who blew it," you stop and correct it out loud. You say, "I'm the man who rebuilt. I'm the man who learned. I'm the man who's not done yet." It'll feel strange at first. That's okay. New chapters always feel strange. Third assignment, do one thing your old story wouldn't let you do. Take one risk that the man who blew it would never take. Sign up for a class, start a small side project. Have a hard conversation with your boss about using more of your skills. It doesn't have to be dramatic, it just has to be something the old character wouldn't choose. We shook hands, and he left. To be honest with you, I meet a lot of people after seminars, and I don't always hear what happens next, but about 2 years later I was speaking in another city, and a man waited in line with a young woman beside him. When he got to me, he smiled and said, "You probably don't remember me. I'm the man whose life ended in 1983. Then he grinned and said, "At least that's who I used to be." He told me he'd had that kitchen table conversation. He said there were tears, some apologies, and then something surprising. His kids started telling him how they'd always seen him as strong, not weak. They weren't ashamed of his story. They were proud of how he handled it. He just hadn't heard it from their side. He'd also taken a risk. He'd gone to his employer and asked to move from the safe, small role he'd been hiding in to a new position that used his old business experience. For the first time in 20 years, he said, "I feel like I'm in motion again. I'm not just enduring my life, I'm participating in it." Was his past gone? No. The facts stayed the same, but the meaning changed. The man who walked into my seminar that first night was carrying his history like a tombstone. The man standing in front of me 2 years later was carrying it like a textbook. Same pages, different purpose. That's the journey. Mistake, awareness, action. Not magic, just a human being who decided he was not his story. He was the one telling it. So now I want to bring it back to you, wherever you're listening from tonight. If you and I were sitting at your kitchen table instead of through a screen, and you told me your story like it was a movie, would you describe your character as doomed or just unfinished? We've talked about the story. Now let's talk about the machinery behind it. Because your life doesn't run on what happened. It runs on what you keep telling yourself about what happened. And if we don't understand that machinery, it'll keep running you on yesterday's software. When I was a boy growing up on that little farm in Idaho, we didn't have much. We had chores, we had cold mornings, we had long days. But you know what else we had? Stories. My father was a storyteller. At the dinner table, he'd tell us about his father, about the hard winters, about the times they almost lost the farm and the times they pulled through. I didn't realize it then, but he was doing something powerful. He wasn't just entertaining us, he was programming us. He was saying, we're the kind of people who work hard. We're the kind of people who don't give up. We're the kind of people who keep our word. That's identity language. We are the kind of people who... Now, that can build you or it can break you depending on the story. Some of you grew up with a very different script. Maybe you heard, in this family we never get ahead. We're not business people. We're not lucky. People like us don't fill in the blank. That's still identity language. The problem isn't that it was said once. The problem is that it got repeated until it moved from the dinner table into your bones. Most people never stop to ask, who wrote that script I'm living by? Was it your parents, your first boss, some painful moment in high school, a divorce, a bankruptcy? Because if you don't ask, you'll spend your whole life acting out a role you didn't consciously choose. Here's something I learned later in life that I wish I'd understood sooner. The mind is a very loyal servant. If you tell it, this is who I am, it will do everything it can to keep you consistent with that statement. Even if that statement is killing your future, you say, I'm not good with money, and your mind says, yes, sir, and it makes sure you ignore the book that could have helped you or forget the appointment with the advisor who could have taught you. You say, I'm bad with people, and your mind says, got it. And it nudges you away from conversations, from opportunities, from relationships you might have built. You say, I always mess things up, and your mind starts collecting evidence. It remembers every mistake and quietly erases the times you got it right. Before long, your story isn't just something you tell, it's something you prove over and over without even knowing you're doing it. That's why I say your story can be more dangerous than your past. Your past is finished, it's a closed chapter, but your story is alive, it's working while you sleep, it's shaping your choices before you're even aware you're making them. Now let's get a little more precise and a little more practical. There are 3 layers to this thing we call story. First, there are the facts, the events. I lost a job in 2009. My marriage ended in 2015. I filed for bankruptcy at 47. These are timestamps. They're real. We don't rewrite those. We don't pretend they didn't happen. We don't need fantasy. We need truth. Second, there's the meaning you gave those facts. I lost a job in 2009 turns into, I'm not valuable. My marriage ended in 2015 turns into, I'm hard to love. I filed for bankruptcy at 47 turns into, I can't be trusted with money. That's not truth, that's interpretation. That's the mind trying to turn a moment into a definition. Third, there's the identity you built on top of that meaning. I'm not valuable. I'm hard to love. I can't be trusted. Those are heavy names to carry around for decades, and yet some people wear them like a uniform. Here's the good news. You can't go back and change the first layer, but you can absolutely challenge the second and rewrite the third. You can't change the facts, but you can change the frame. And when you change the frame, the person in the frame starts to look very different. Think of it like this. If you hang a painting in a dark hallway and stare at it from 3 inches away, you'll only see a few ugly strokes of paint. You'll say, this isn't very good. But if you turn on the light and take 3 steps back, you see the whole picture. You see how the dark strokes make the bright ones stand out. You see shape, you see purpose. A lot of people are pressed up against one dark stroke of their life, calling the whole canvas a disaster. I drank too much. I cheated once. I went to prison. I walked away when I should have stayed. And they stay nose to painting for 10, 20, 30 years. No wonder they think they are their worst decision. They've never stepped back far enough to see the rest of who they are. Let me remind you of something simple and uncomfortable. Bad decisions are part of the human story. Yours, mine, everybody's. The question is not, did you mess up? The question is, what did you build after the mess? The world doesn't just need your victories, it needs your redeemed mistakes. See, people think their credibility comes from perfection. They think, if I had never failed, then I'd have the right to speak, to lead, to help others. But who do you trust more? A man who's never fallen, or a man who's fallen, broken something, and learned how to walk again? I know who I listen to. Your past doesn't disqualify you. Ignoring it does. Hiding from it does. Letting it own your name does. But when you take your story, drag it into the light, and say, here's what I did, here's what it cost me, and here's what I changed, that's not shame anymore. That's service. That's you turning your history into a toolkit for somebody else. Let's talk about age for a moment. Because some of you listening are in your 50s, 60s, 70s, and you're thinking, Jim, this sounds nice, but be honest. Haven't I already written most of my story? I understand that feeling. I've looked at the calendar too. But let me offer you a different picture. Imagine your life as a book on a shelf. Thick spine, many chapters. Maybe some of those chapters are messy, some you're proud of, some you'd rather tear out. Here's the mistake older people make. They look at the book and say, well, that's it, that's who I am. They forget one very important fact. As long as you're breathing, the book is still being written. You might have 300 pages behind you and 20 pages ahead. Someone younger might have 50 pages behind and 300 ahead. But listen carefully, the last 20 pages of a book can change the meaning of the first 300. You've seen this in a movie. The ending makes you reinterpret the beginning. A character you thought was weak turns out to be brave. A loss you thought was meaningless becomes the turning point. What if the final chapters of your life could put a new frame around everything that came before? What if the man who wasted years could become the man who finally woke up and showed his children what change looks like at 60? What if the woman who stayed silent for decades became the woman who used her story to protect others at 65? Do you see it? The events didn't change. The meaning did. And once the meaning changes, the story you hand to the next generation is entirely different. Your grandchildren won't just inherit your DNA or your furniture, they'll inherit your story. The question is, what version will they receive? Grandpa was the man who blew it, or Grandpa was the man who turned it around late when most people would have given up. Both might be rooted in the same facts, but one builds courage into their bones and the other builds fear. Now let's get down to how you actually begin to separate yourself from your story, not in theory, but in practice. First step, catch your labels. Pay attention to the sentences that start with I am and I always. I'm just not the disciplined type. I always choose the wrong people. I'm the one in the family who, that's story language. That's your identity leaking out. Write those phrases down. Don't argue with them yet. Just get them on paper. You can't change a script you refuse to see. Second step, separate the event from the interpretation. Next to each label, ask, what actually happened? Get specific like a reporter. Not, I'm terrible with money, but in 2012, I maxed out 3 credit cards and ignored the bills. Not, I ruin relationships, but I shut down when I feel criticized, and I've repeated that in 2 marriages. That's not a life sentence. That's a description of behavior. Behavior can be changed. Labels feel permanent. Behavior feels workable. Third step, ask a better question about the same event. Instead of, what did this prove about me? Ask, what did this reveal that I needed to learn? One question chains you to shame. The other opens the door to growth. Fourth step, choose a new identity phrase on purpose. Not fantasy. Not, I'm a billionaire by Friday. something honest but different. I'm a man who is learning discipline. I'm a woman who is rebuilding trust with herself. I'm someone who used to hide and is now practicing courage. You see the difference? The old story was a period, the new one is a comma. Then you practice it, you speak it. You act out small pieces of it. That's how you retrain the mind. Not by wishing, but by repetition. Now someone might say, but Jim, isn't that just pretending? Isn't that just positive thinking? Let me answer you straight. No. Pretending is ignoring the facts. Positive thinking is over-sugarcoating the facts. What I'm talking about is accurate thinking. It's including all the facts. The fact that you failed, and the fact that you're still here. The fact that you messed up, and the fact that you're willing to learn. The fact that you hurt people, and the fact that you can apologize and change. Most people only record the first half. No wonder their story is so dark. I'll tell you a little secret. A lot of the power of my own story isn't that I was poor and became financially independent. Lots of people have done that. The power is that I stopped telling the story of poor farm boy with no chance and started telling the story of farm boy who decided to learn, who found a mentor, who changed his philosophy and therefore his life. The turning point was not the money. It was the day I stopped saying, look at what life did to me, and started saying, look at what I'm going to do with what life did to me. That's the same shift waiting for you. You don't have to forget your past. You don't have to erase it, deny it, hide it. You just have to stop bowing to it. You treat it like a teacher, not a warden. You visit it for wisdom, not for punishment. You say thank you for the lessons, and then you walk back into today and make a better choice. There's one more piece I want to give you in this part of our conversation. It's about responsibility. Because until you accept responsibility for the story you're telling now, you'll always feel like a character instead of the author. You are not responsible for everything that happened to you. People did things, systems failed you, life threw some unfair punches, but you are responsible fully and completely for the story you choose to tell about it now. That's where your freedom lives. Not in the events, but in the decision about what those events will mean going forward. And the beautiful thing is you can make that decision at 25 or 75. The calendar might change how much time you have to use it, but it doesn't change your right to choose it. So here we are, you and I, at this point in your life, not in theory, but in reality. You have your history on one side and your future on the other, and your story is standing in the middle like a bridge or a wall. And my simple challenge to you in this moment is this. Will you keep letting an old, unchallenged story sit in the author's chair of your life, or are you finally ready to pick up the pen and start rewriting who you are from this day forward? Now let's go even further. Because if history is a door, then analysis is what stands behind it. Hidden mechanisms, deep fears, shadows we carry for years without even noticing how they guide our hands, our voice, our decisions. Most people aren't afraid of the past. They're afraid of a future that requires a new me. And here is the paradox I discovered in myself one evening, sitting in that small apartment with the bills on the table. It wasn't the past holding me down. I was holding on to it with both hands because everything else was unknown. We hide inside our history the same way a child hides under a blanket. The child knows the darkness in the room won't disappear, but the blanket gives the illusion of control. Adults hide in familiar pain the same way because it's known. A new path is scarier than old scars. Now let's break this down to the bone. There are three forces that tie a person to an old version of themselves, so strongly that they confuse past experience with the fact of their nature. The first force is the fear of being without a story. Everyone has an inner shelf with a sign that says, "This is who I am." And even if the sign is crooked, full of mistakes, even if it mocks you, it's familiar. And the familiar often feels safe. You can tell yourself for years, "I'm not made for this. That's just my personality. I'm just that kind of person." But in reality, that's not personality. It's a defense mechanism you accepted as your essence. The second force is the belief that old pain equals old truth. A person thinks, if a memory still hurts, then it still defines me. No. Pain is just a trace. Like a scar on your knee from falling as a child, a scar can ache, but it doesn't affect your ability to walk. Adults carry emotional scars and behave as if they're still limping, even though the body has long healed, but the story hasn't. The third force is the inertia of old philosophy. You can live in a new home, but think like someone from your old neighborhood. You can work at a new job, but react like someone shaped by old failures. You can stand in a new year, but act like a version of yourself from 1998. Philosophy is a silent engine. What you believe about yourself deep inside works even when you're quiet. It decides what you attempt, whom you trust, whom you talk to, which doors you open and which ones you fear. And that's why most people stubbornly repeat the same life patterns. Not because they're doomed, but because they don't know how to think differently than they thought yesterday. Let me tell you something important, simple, but I want you to hear it not with your ears, but with your inner space. There is nothing more dangerous than an unexamined story about yourself. What you believe about yourself can lift you up or destroy you. It can create or it can burn everything to ashes. Now stop. Before we go further, I want to give you a moment of silence. Imaginary, but very necessary. Because sometimes the most important thing isn't what I say, but what rises in your mind after these words. Sometimes the lesson isn't in the words, it's in the silence after them. Good, let's move on. There is one more thing almost no one talks about. Most people hold on to their old story not because they can't let it go, but because they're afraid that without it, they'll have to create a new one. And then there will be no one left to blame. There is always someone guilty in a story. Parents, the state, the times, a partner, childhood, circumstances. This gives us a convenient exit. I am this way because that's what happened. But a new story always asks, and who will you choose to be now? And that's where it gets scary. Because responsibility is freedom that frightens. Freedom is not just possibility, it is also choice, discipline, and risk. That's why many people, even with a chance to change, return to their old story. Not because it's better, but because it's familiar. And now, since we've already opened all these internal mechanisms, I want to ask a question. A simple one, but so sharp that it can cut the chain you've carried for decades. If tomorrow you woke up without your old story, without old definitions, without old labels, without the old, "that's just who I am," how would you behave tomorrow? All right, now, we stand at the very point where history stops being the past and starts being your choice. This is the final push. Not a motivational firework, that's not what I'm talking about, but a quiet, steady, adult strength that appears when a person finally stops hiding behind who they were and takes the courage to become who they can be. Listen to me carefully. You don't have to wait for the perfect moment, a new opportunity, or approval from someone who has long been living their own life. The only permission you need is the one you give yourself. The only threshold you need to cross is the threshold between the old "I'm still who I used to be" and the new "I am not obligated to repeat my yesterday." You can stop repeating yourself. You can stop describing yourself with old words. You can stop believing in what stopped being true long ago. Because here's the truth, the past will not wake up tomorrow, walk into your room, grab you by the hand, and tell you that you have no right to a new life. Only your beliefs do that. A scrap of history you somehow allowed to take the position of director of your future. Here is the moment in which you need to do something very simple and very decisive. Take the old story, not burn it, not reject it, not pretend it never happened, but place it on the shelf, in its place. Among the books you've already read and taken everything you could from. Because now it's time to write another book, not a continuation of the old one, not a rewritten version of yesterday's, but a new chapter, a new mood, a new tone. I want you to feel this not as a pretty phrase, but as an inner shift. You are not obligated to live the same story twice. No human being is condemned to repetition, only to choice. And when you stand in front of the mirror today, I want that instead of the usual "here I am," something else will sound inside. Here I am, the one who is starting over. Not from zero, from wisdom, from experience, from survival, from awareness. The kind that age doesn't take away but brings. Every tiredness, every loss, every shame, every rise and every fall, all of this is already paid for. You lived through it. You carried it. You stood through it. What else has to happen for you to finally give yourself the right to live as someone who survived, not someone who's stuck? Now, I'll ask you for one thing. Don't rush to the next task. Don't close this video and go back to your usual thoughts. A little later, I will leave a few minutes of silence. Don't rush to the next thing. Just sit with it. This silence is not a pause. It is the moment when the new story can take root in your inner soil. Because strength doesn't come from loud decisions. Strength comes from the quiet but genuine, "I no longer live in the past, I take the lesson from it, and move on." And before we move into this silence, let me ask you one final question, one of those that won't let you go even after the screen turns off. Which version of yourself are you ready to write now when the old story no longer commands your life?